Good morning. We're continuing in Esther chapter 2 this morning. You want to turn there. And I will tell you again, I encourage conversation, discussion during the whole quarter, just because there is not a lot of content in the book with the verses they give us. All right, so last week we looked at Esther. She was selected from among all of the nations of the Persian Empire. And remember, that consisted of nearly half of the population of the entire earth at the time. So Esther was one of 400 girls that were selected as one of the prettiest, most beautiful women to come before the king, to be presented before him as one of the young virgins who might potentially become the king's wife. So she was brought to the palace and she was placed in the custody of Haggai and quickly earned his favor. And so she was given beauty treatments and foods and special treatment above and beyond what all the other women were given. She was given the best place in the harem, the best place in the court of the concubines. She was given 7 servants from the king's palace, which evidently wasn't common at the time. So right from the get-go, she received special treatment from Haggai, who was the eunuch in charge of the harem, in charge of all the ladies that would go before the king. Going into this, if you'll recall, Mordecai had told Esther not to tell anybody else that she was a Jew, at least not yet. And so at this point, she had followed the advice of her uncle, and she had not told anybody that she was a Jew. And then we also saw at the end of the lesson last week that Mordecai stayed close by at the gates of the palace, I guess, whatever the king's place was. He stayed outside the gates in the courtyard of the harem, or outside the courtyard of the harem, just waiting to see what would happen with Esther. And so today we'll pick up in Esther chapter 2, starting in verses 12 through 14. Now when the turn of each lady came to go into King Xerxes, after the end of her 12 months, under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go in to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, the custody of Shazgah, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would, did I pass it up? No, she would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So the custom in this place and time for bride preparation was very lengthy, specifically for royalty. And it consisted of ritualistic baths, applications of beauty paste all over the body that were meant to lighten the color of the skin and remove any spots and blemishes. They would pluck the eyebrows. They would paint the bodies with tattoos. They would do all kinds of facial makeup. Specifically, it tells us they had 6 months of treatment with oils of myrrh. So what was that intended to do? Does anybody know what myrrh does? I didn't remember. I had to look it up. Kind of a preservative. Antibacterial. Yep. So it would remove any odors, body odors. They lived in a hot climate, so it was intended to remove any body odor that they had. It also has characteristics that would remove any dry skin issues or things like that that they might have. So it was just intended to make their skin soft and nice. And then they had 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. We don't have much detail on that. I assume that was intended to help them find whatever scent that they liked best and whatever makeups that they liked best, how they wanted to present themselves. But they had a total of 12 months in this case, 12 months of preparation before the young ladies would even go before the king. There's also another reason that they spent so long doing preparations, not just in this instance, but in other instances, before somebody was selected to be chosen as a bride. What other reason can you think of why you might want to let nearly a year go by before going before a king as a virgin? Make sure she really was a virgin. Make sure that she wasn't with child. They didn't want to take a virgin before the king or a lady before the king who was with child and then think it was the king's child. So they were kept away also for that reason as well. So all these girls had basically a full year of spa treatment. If you think about what they were doing, it was just nothing but spa treatment all day long. They weren't expected to help. They weren't servants. They had servants, and so they were pampered for a full year. So for that year, I imagine probably they were all pretty excited. They were probably living the high life, if I had to guess. Being pampered, taken away from whatever lifestyle they were in. They probably didn't get this in their normal lifestyle. And so these women were pampered. And if they weren't chosen, what happened to them? So it was all well and good for a year, but after the year, if the king didn't ever call them back, where were they? Did they go back to their home? No, they stayed in the harem. They stayed in the king as the king's concubine, just waiting for if the king ever wanted to call them back again. And so while it's all well and good for that first year, if you're not the one lady that's selected or one of the few that he chooses as a concubine, then the rest of your life you're spent where you're banned from marrying anybody else. And so you just live in the court of women in the palace. So it's good for them for a year, but then for the rest of them after that, not so much. It just amazes me. So I'm going to take an aside here because, again, there's not much lesson, so this is kind of a sidetrack. But it just amazes me when you think about how many people's lives were centered around nothing more than the king's sexual desires. So he called in these 400 women in addition to all the others that were already there. They weren't the first 400. He already had concubines. But he called in the 400 prettiest women in his empire. And they had all these people that looked over them, served them, and their sole purpose in life was for the king's sexual desires. It was a common practice thousands of years ago, very much for kings, but also for rich people. Anybody that had enough money to have a harem, if the man chose to do so, he had a harem, and it just was common practice. It wasn't questioned. Nobody thought anything about it. It was just what happened at the time. It's not quite as common a practice today, although it does exist in very few cultures or something similar to it, but we're certainly not any better as a society than we were back then. We've just taken that sin in a different form. Instead of being for the rich and powerful, now we've got sexual gratification is available at the fingertips of virtually anybody in a first world country. So it's very similar to what they had, just for more people. More people now have access to it. Millions of people today still center their whole lives around sexual gratification. From the adult film industry, adult bookstores, newer trends online, virtual live things that they do, and not just adult entertainment. It's even ingrained in the TV that we watch. All the advertisements that we see, this sin is everywhere. Why is it everywhere? Why is it being thrown down our throats? Why is it $1 billion industry in our country? Because people do it. People like it. It's tempting. It's a temptation. It's tempting people, even for Christians that know it's a sin. You know, we all have our temptations, so for many people, it's a sin, and they're tempted by it. And it's been so successful over the last however long that it's now become ingrained in the everyday TV shows that we watch. And we don't even think anything about it as we watch the shows with our families. But yet there are people everywhere that watch these shows, and it causes temptation for them. It causes sin for them because we've let it become ingrained into what we watch every day. And that's not the only sin. I don't think our issue today is any individual sin in and of itself. I think our issue in our world today is very similar to what you saw before Noah, in the time of Noah. It's selfishness. Everybody wants to be satisfied and do whatever satisfies them. And so I think that makes us different than cultures before us. I would say even 100 years ago, I don't think that culture was centered around self-satisfaction, self-gratification. And so that's something that our generation's dealing with that we haven't really seen generation-wide, I don't think, in thousands of years. But it's not just the one sin. If you look, drugs and alcohol don't have the same stigma that they had 20 years ago, 50 years ago. They're just out in the open. We continue to legalize things that make people not sober and give people a reason to get high or drunk or whatever. Gluttony's another one that just still amazes me to this day. We don't ever talk about gluttony. We're a country that has abundant food at our fingertips. We can eat whatever we want, and nobody ever really encourages us not to eat more than we should. Yet we know in the Bible that that is a sin for those who are tempted by it. But because of our culture, because of the abundance of what we have, because of our self-centered attitude, we don't talk about it. So as Christians, we have to know how to resist the temptations of the world. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul is talking to the Christians at the time about what food is acceptable to eat, because before that, the Jews didn't eat certain foods. So Paul was talking to them about what foods were acceptable. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 23. It says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's, and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and wants you to go eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. So what's he telling the Christians here at this point in time? What's the whole purpose of this writing to Christians? Y'all are super talkative today. Right. So he's telling them, well, first of all, he says, seek not your own good, but the good of your neighbor. And so at the heart of what he's talking about is, don't insult the people around you by doing something or by not doing something that really isn't a sin. So he's telling them, everything is clean. God has made everything clean. He's made that clear to us. Don't refuse meat when somebody offers it to you because it might offend them. And we talked at length last week about as Christians, offending others or not offending others. We can't just come in and just bang them over the head with the Bible and teach all the things right away that we want to teach them. We have to get to know people, and so I think that's at the heart of what he's saying here. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. In Cuba, there's a lot of really good food, and then there's a few that I don't really want to try, but I at least try it to make sure that they know that I'm trying, right? So that's the point he's trying to make, is don't offend those that you're around. Live your life in such a way that others around you, that you're focused on others around you more than yourself. Don't be selfish. That's what he starts the whole passage out by saying. Don't be selfish. Look out for the good of others. So, it's okay to interact with non-believers. It's okay to have friends at work who don't believe in God, who aren't Christians. It's okay to live and be friends with them. And what the Bible's telling us here is when we're dealing with those people, don't offend them by saying, well, I'm holier than thou, I can't do that, if it's not something that specifically isn't a sin. I think we're guilty of that sometimes as Christians. If you look at Jesus, I think we talked about this before. Jesus ate meals with sinners. He went and had meals with them. He had conversations with them that we see the result of were positive. And so we know, we don't get the full interaction that he had with them, but we know that if the result of that conversation was positive, that he got to know the person first. He started with common ground. Right. Right. That's right. Yes. Right. That's right. So really the passage is all about focusing on others, looking at the needs of others above ourselves. We should be able to do the same. Just as Jesus went in and talked to sinners and got to know them and ate whatever they gave before him, we should be able to do the same. We're going out to eat with coworkers. Let them pick the restaurant sometimes. Don't be the person that always has to pick whatever it is. You don't have to like what you're going to eat. Let somebody else pick the activities. It's the simple things that I think we often forget about because our society is so self-centered. It's so focused on satisfying myself. I don't want to do that. No thanks. I appreciate the invitation. I'm not coming. And that's not the way that the Bible tells us to get to know others. In Proverbs chapter 11, verse 25, it says, "A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed." So again, focusing on others above ourselves. All right, let's shift now back to verse 15 in Esther chapter 2, verse 15. Now in the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king. She did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Xerxes to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So first it tells us that she gained the favor of Haggai rather quickly, the man who was in charge of all the women. And then also, just like Mordecai had given her advice before she went into the king, before she went in to see into the harem, now somebody who she had gained the favor of gives her advice. Before you go see the king, he tells her what to take, what to do. He's the one that oversaw all of the women coming and going to the king. And so there's no doubt he knew what the king preferred, what the king liked. And so he advised her probably on what clothes to wear, what jewelry to wear, what perfumes that the king might like. And so Esther showed humility in listening to his advice. She didn't go against anything that he said. She didn't take anything else in addition to what he said. She took the advice of Haggai. And then beyond that, it tells us, beyond just Haggai, it says she obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So there's no doubt that she was a beautiful young girl. First of all, we've already said she's one of the most beautiful 400 women in the empire, right? But it tells us above and beyond that, she was a very beautiful woman. Everybody that saw her, she found favor. But I think we all know beauty only gets you so far. That you have to also have the personality to go along with it. And so that's what the Bible leads us to believe here, is that she had some personality traits, some godliness that was attractive to other people, that made other people like her. She gained their favor. That's not always the case with people with good looks. Sometimes people that look really good think that they're God's gift to the world and they can treat people however they want to. And Esther wasn't that way. She was humble. She listened to the advice of those around her. It also tells us that the king loved Esther more than the other women. So this is something I think that's interesting and telling about King Xerxes that may make him a little bit different than some of the other kings in his time. A lot of times the kings had all of these women and they didn't really care about the women. They were just, again, there for the king's sexual gratification. And so it tells us that he loved Esther more than the other women. So not only Esther, he loved some of the other women. Not just that he liked, not that he favored. It says that he loved her and loved them. Also, we've seen in the chapter before what his thoughts were on Vashti, his queen before, that had been banished. So the king, I think, that trait that he had, his ability to see women as more than just objects for gratification, I think that was also likely part of God's plan for Esther and for the Jews at the time, is that God had that king in place so that he would accept Esther. So Xerxes makes Esther his queen, and again, as we saw in the first chapter, he throws a big party. And really, it looks to me like he got what he wanted with Vashti. So he threw a party that was Esther's banquet. He brought in all the princes, all the royalty, and essentially this is her banquet where he's presenting her to the people around him. And that's what Vashti refused to do at the end of the last banquet. And so he shows Esther off to those around him. And she obliges. She goes along with it. Just as she'd been advised to by Mordecai, just as she had been advised to by Haggai, she goes along with what the king wants. All right, we'll read through 19 through 23. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. So verse 19 there says, when the virgins were gathered together a second time. I have no idea why the virgins were gathered together a second time. After he'd already selected his king, he'd already probably seen all of the 400 women. I have no idea what they were doing. I have no idea why it's included in the text. So if anybody has any insight on that, please let me know. But we don't know what that's about, I don't think. But we do know at that time, whenever that happened, Mordecai appears to have been given a position within the king's walls. Whereas before he was outside talking to anybody that might be coming and going, trying to find out about Esther. Now, with Esther as queen, then he was appointed to some sort of position where he was inside the king's palace and inside his closest people. Probably either Esther requested that, or it could just be a gesture of appreciation for Mordecai for bringing Esther before him.
You mentioned earlier that after the illness, they were remounted out or whatever, don't go back to their homes.
Most likely, yes. To tell them what's going on. That's a good point. Yeah, that could be. Yeah, that's good speculation. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Yeah. You weren't selected. Now you get to stay here forever. Okay, so it tells us that there were two guards there. The guards were mad. I think one version says at the gates, another one says at the doors. I think it is on the outside of the palace, not the inside of the palace. But it says two guards were mad, and so they were conspiring to kill the king. What could they be mad about that they were wanting to kill the king? Do what? Yeah, right, anything, right? So many things that people got mad at kings about. Could have been because they had a woman that was in one of the 399 that didn't get picked. Could have been anything that he had done for whatever reason. But anyway, these two guards were mad at him. So they were conspiring to kill him. So these are two guards. If they're out at the outer gate, I just think, would they have been successful in their plot had Mordecai not overheard and told somebody about it? I think probably not. You know, if you just think about, he wasn't just a king, he was an emperor. He was king over the empire of Persia. And so at the time, he would have had so many protocols in place before of who could come before him, who could get within, whatever distance of him. Guns weren't around for 1,500 years, so that wasn't an option. So I don't think necessarily that they would have been successful in their plot, but I think this is part of God's plan for Mordecai, for the Jews, to be able to save the Jews from what Haman is planning for them, which we'll talk about next week. So God puts Mordecai in the right spot at the right time. Mordecai overhears this plot that's going on. He reports it to Esther. And so it is interesting here because also before he had to send word from somebody else to Esther, and now it appears that he's able to talk to Esther directly. And so he tells Esther what he heard. Esther has an ear with the king, which also is telling because a lot of times back in those days, even the queen didn't get to talk to the king unless the king wanted to call on her. And so it seems like there was really good relationships between the king and Esther, and then Esther and Mordecai. Because he would come from outside the gates, and now he was inside the gates. So he was allowed inside the king's, I don't know if it's the palace walls or whatever that was, but yeah. I think it says that it says at the king's gate in this one, but there are other translations that say that he was inside the gates. And also just by the fact that he's able to talk to Esther directly, we can assume that he was now inside the king's inner circle of some sort. So God puts Mordecai there, the right spot, at the right time. He overhears this conversation. And so Mordecai is able to prevent this alleged assassination of the king. And so with God's providence, he does the same with us. He puts us in the right place at the right time so that we can accomplish his will. He gives us opportunities every day to treat others with respect. He gives us opportunities to share his love with others and to further his kingdom and his word. There's no shortage of people that we have that we can witness to every day that we come across. It does tell us that Mordecai, or doesn't tell us, it appears that Mordecai was looking for opportunities to please the king. There was one commentary I thought was interesting that said Mordecai could have been one that said, I don't care anything about the king. I don't care if they kill him, and so he would have just left it alone. But if you think about it, he had a vested interest in King Xerxes. He had now his niece, who he raised as a daughter, was married to King Xerxes. If somebody were to overthrow the king, very likely meant that his niece would have been killed as well. And so he had a vested interest in the king's success because of who his daughter was. And so I think it's the same for us. We have to be looking for opportunities. Just as Mordecai was always looking to please the king because of his position, we have to be looking for those opportunities as adopted children of the king, right? The same as Mordecai had that relationship with the king, we have a relationship with God, our king, through Christ. And so we should have his interest at heart in everything that we do. All right, any discussion or questions before we close for today? Audley, would you care to close this in prayer?